Welcome to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's radical potential. I'm your host, Jordan Corson. Apologies to listeners for my voice. I'm getting over a bout of COVID and I'm a little exhausted and a little foggy, but I'm very excited to share our guest today is Rabbi Alissa Wise, an organizer and educator based in Philadelphia. And since Alissa is a rabbi, I thought initially on this short introduction I would talk about my own relationship to synagogues. And strangely though, I'm going to talk about something else that's in my head. And I'm recording this the day after the Philadelphia Eagles just won their second Super Bowl. And of course, sports are very complicated to talk about on a podcast about radical education, but I bring this up not to just say go birds, but of course go birds. I actually bring up because there's this very small moment, hours and hours after the game. We were stuck inside and we were still watching. My partner and I were still watching TV at like 1:30 or 2 in the morning, and the news was just desperate to find anybody they could still interview, and they went to a Dick's Sporting Goods where people were buying Super Bowl merchandise, and there were a few stragglers who were still in the store, and they found this one man and they said, "How do you feel about the Super Bowl?" And they said, "Oh, I feel it's so wonderful. We did so great tonight. We were on our game on defense. We were doing this." And then this person pauses and it's like, of course I'm doing the thing that all Philadelphia fans do, which is we use we as if every person in the Philadelphia region is an active participant on the Eagles roster. But then he pauses again and he looks at the reporter and he's like, "Yeah, but Philadelphia is a we city." And in that strange kind of delirious, euphoric moment, as I'm watching TV, something hit me so hard that I think gets at the core of what today's episode is about. We talk a lot on this podcast about the notion of doikite, of here-ness. And, I don't want to ruin the specific stories that Rabbi Wise shares, but they're full of this notion of caring for a place and building a place with those around you, and what it means to be a rabbi by caring for and tending to the people around you, and how, of course, this notion of we is always very complicated, and who gets to count as we is very complicated, but how building an other world, the making other worlds possible, is a project about building a home and building place and rooting yourself in time and place through kind of collective, through the work of making a we. And so with that, let's listen to Rabbi Wise. Alissa Wise, welcome to Another Education is Possible. Thank you so much for being on.
I'm happy to be here.
I just want to jump right in and ask, what your upbringing looked like. What did education look like when you were growing up in terms of Israel, your understanding of Palestine, your relationship to Judaism?
Yeah. So I was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I was part of a kind of small, very traditional Jewish community and very Zionist Jewish community. I was raised at a Jewish day school, where my education really consisted mostly of Holocaust in Israel. That was kind of the bedrock of the education that I got. And, the Jewish day school obviously taught, regular school topics, but then half the day was reserved for Hebrew language and Jewish studies, which all of which really reinforced Zionism and this logic that the legacy of the Holocaust was that the world turned its back on the Jews, and that's why we need Israel, because you kind of can't trust your neighbors or other people to take care of Jews, and we have to take care of ourselves. And the way that we do that is by having this nation state of Israel. And I think I didn't realize at the time, but in retrospect, that like all of the interpretation of Jewish holidays and the way that Hebrew language was taught to us was refracted through a Zionist lens, and um, it's kind of amazing how complete that was. I think I was at the heyday, right? Like I was in elementary school from the mid 80s to the mid 90s. And I think that, because of the ways that the Jewish community post 1967 kind of really took on support for Israel and Zionism as like the main bedrock of Jewish identity, right? Like the Jewish education I got really was a product of that. All my teachers who taught me Hebrew were uh, Israelis who are now living in the US. And then I got a lot of my Jewish education also at home, right? So we had a very kind of vibrant Jewish life. Like our life as a family really revolved around the Jewish holiday cycle on Shabbat. And I had a wide circle of family that I, spent almost every Shabbat with and every Jewish holiday. And kind of that was, was very much like we lived very much a Jewish life in Cincinnati, right? And it wasn't until I was in high school when I went to public school that I started to have, friends and community who weren't Jewish. Actually, I think the beginning was when I joined Community Soccer League, right? And was the first time I started having non-Jewish friends. And then I also went to Jewish summer camp, which was the same of the Holocaust in Israel education. And there, the education that I got was really, they had a kind of, I don't want to put like Paulo Freire type educational philosophies in their mouths. I don't know that that is exactly what they had in mind, but it was very embodied in that way of, I remember at summer camp doing, reenactments of Arab-Israeli war. There was actually like one letter that I found in a box in my mom's house. We were looking through some stuff where I wrote a letter from camp that she saved, where I said, today we played Arab-Israeli war. I was an Arab, frowny face, but luckily we lost. Just like terrible amounts of anti-Arab racism that I was indoctrinated with, and a kind of idea that Jews living by the sword was just a fact of Jewish life, right? Like that was kind of our only option for survival. And so when you ask about Palestine, I mean, I think one of the things that's important to say is that there was the word Palestinian and Palestine was never uttered in my upbringing. The myth of a land without a people for a people without a land was really strong. And Arab was the word right? That was what I said in my letter home, right? And my family took us to Israel multiple times growing up. I went on a tour of concentration camps when I was 16 with my camp. And then we went from the concentration camp tour to Israel for 6 weeks, and part of it was, it was not very subtle, right? It really was like go to this, place where Jews were decimated. And then I remember like landing in Israel then and like, we all like kissed the ground and we're so happy to have this Jewish state where we could be safe, and it wasn't until I decided to go to spend my junior year abroad at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, because I was still a Zionist at that point, And it was only then that I learned about Palestinians and I learned about the Nakba. And that was the moment where my politics shifted, was that year that I spent there in 1999 to 2000, where I felt really betrayed and lied to by my family and by the educators who taught me growing up. And over the years, I've really struggled with that. Like that was a dominant feeling, was I felt very lied to and misled. And I've come to understand that my family didn't know, right? Like about the Nakba, they also weren't taught it. I still hold them responsible for having the responsibility to educate themselves about that and know it, right? Like it doesn't leave them off the hook for the fact that they, um, you know, did pass on a education of that was incomplete and um, kind of absolve themselves the responsibility for the crises on the ground in Israel Palestine. And so that was really formative, of that sense that the way that I was taught, right, was um was manipulative, right? And I felt manipulated into feeling a certain way about Israel and about Jewish life. And so it was from that point on that my politics really shifted.
There's something so interesting there about, it sounds like what we in education would call a hidden curriculum, right? You're being taught Hebrew, but you're actually being taught Zionism. You're being taught math, but you're being taught Zionism, which is strange because normally the hidden curriculum doesn't have a converse, which is the explicit curriculum, because nobody needed to hide it, because they were also saying, also be a Zionist, also Israel is your history, your present, and your future. It's your refuge. It is your destiny, your birthright, all of these things. And I don't want to create too much of a linear path, but before we get into this moment of rupture, I'm wondering if we could stay for just a moment, if you have any memories of anyone during this time in Ohio during summer camp, of people challenging that Zionism in any way, or even just speaking.
No, I really don't. I mean, it really, like in my memory, it wasn't until that Hebrew University experience when I wasn't being handheld by counselors or parents or something in my trips to Israel. Because previous to that, like my times that I was in Israel, where I might have been able to learn because Palestinians are there, right? And Palestinian history is there, but I was being led by people who were deliberately hiding it from me. I remember understanding during that time, I started to understand, for example, the role of the Jewish National Fund, or the JNF, in the erasure of Palestinian land and villages. And I toured with, this was actually later when I was in rabbinical school. I took some tours with the Jewish Israeli group Zochrot, which means remembering. And they're a group that brings the history of the Nakba into Israeli society. And I remember going to some of the JNF forests that I had gone to as a young person and been told, like, those are Roman ruins underneath this village, right? And like there was like an actual like complete erasure, right? That was part of it, and let alone that the planting of the trees that we were encouraged to do through the Jewish National Fund, and the little boxes that we would fill with coins. And I got trees planted in my honor when I was born, and again in my bat mitzvah, right? And so it was, and then that was actually a tool of erasure of Palestinian life, and so I think there wasn't anyone to go against the grain of the Zionist narrative that I had at that time, and it's kind of, and I've struggled over the years to think about kind of what was it? What was the mix of things that was happening for me where I was open to hearing another perspective, at that time, because really was raised to be a Jewish Zionist woman and defender of the Jewish people, which you know, it's interesting because my work now, like I still feel that I became a rabbi for that purpose, is to tend to the Jewish people and our
Mm.
spiritual and ethical and moral health, right? So I have a trajectory from my childhood, but it was that Zionism piece that felt that needed to be excised in order for me to feel kind of in alignment. But it really was, um, I really didn't have those that pushback until college. Yeah, I was pretty contained.
So, what is it that drew you to Israel? Because some of us, U.S. Ashkenazi Jews, feel like, oh, we should make Aliyah. I'm going to join the IOF. I mean, I don't think you say the IOF when you're thinking of doing that, but and some folks are like, no, Israel's a great place to visit with family. But what drew you to want to go to Israel?
Yeah, it's from what I remember, I was raised in a traditional Jewish environment. I grew up in an Orthodox synagogue and was very gender segregated, right? And as I grew up, I kind of moved away from like I didn't have any models of liberal Jewish life, religious life, but I had this understanding of secular Israeliness, right? As a way to be Jewish and outside of religious life. And so, and I also was like, I remember growing up, I always would challenge my family of like, if we support Israel so much, why don't we live there? Like it didn't make
Mm.
sense to me. Like I was like, that's the whole point. And so when I moved in to Hebrew U my June in 1999, I kind of imagined that I would stay and make Aliyah. Like that's kind of how I understood what I would do because it like the way that I internalized it was like if we really mean this, then we need to mean it, and live there and be part of building it. So I think it was that the thing that drew me was that it was such a focal point of my identity. And I was a Jewish studies major in
Mm.
college. And at that point, I think I actually thought that I had an idea for like a more, um, I don't know that I would say progressive, but I don't know exactly what I had in mind, but a kind of a innovative way to do Jewish day school. I imagine being like a day school principal, but doing it in a more interesting way than what I had. That was kind of my idea of what I was going to do with my life when I started college. I had been an educator in local synagogues in Cincinnati throughout um, junior high and high school, right? Because I went to Jewish day school. So then I was put into being an educator, right? And so a leader, and I was a leader in my community. And so I was really kind of encouraged to take on raising the next generation of American Jewish Zionists, right? And I kind of took that on. And so that's kind of what drew me was that I felt that sense of this is a way that I can um, contribute to my community and kind of live the values that I was taught, right? Was through um, making Aliyah, becoming an Israeli citizen. That's kind of what I imagined for myself. But the year I spent there turned out quite different.
Yeah. And so let's zoom in. What happened? Was this rupture a single moment at the Hebrew University?
Yeah. I mean, I have a memory. I know it probably didn't work this way, but I have a memory of like the first moment, which was a protest on the campus from the Palestinian Israeli students with a flag that I had never seen, talking about an occupation that I had never heard of. And I remember I went up to them and said, it's so embarrassing. But I did say, like, a land without a people for a people. Like, I was like, what are you talking, And they were like, no.
What the fuck are you talking about? We've been here.
Yeah. It's pretty humiliating. But that's what I was taught, like that's what I came with. And that was pretty early on. I remember that being like in the first couple of weeks that I was on campus there. And I, one thing that to take a step back is one thing that I think was like primed me to be open to what happened next after I said that was that the year before I had just started to understand leftism. Like I wasn't a leftist, and I wasn't even in college, like I wasn't really exposed to left organizing until like just like the few months before um I moved to Jerusalem, when I took part in some anti-WTO protests. There was like a G8 summit in Cincinnati, where I'm from, and I took part. And I was like, I was really had no idea. Like I was like very getting my sea legs, right? But it might have been that kind of like opened a little bit of a crack for me. Just that experience. And then basically how I remember it is that there was kind of layers to the unraveling. So after that interaction, the students who I said that to were actually really generous with me and engaged with me. And I started basically re-educating myself. And it started, what I remember first reading that was really um that I feel like kind of opened the floodgates, was actually Ben Gurion's diary, David Ben
Oh,
Gurion, who was
wow.
the first prime minister of Israel. And he spoke really explicitly in his diary about that there was this indigenous Palestinian population there that they would have to displace. And um it wasn't he wasn't necessarily apologetic about it, right? It just was like a fact of and I remember that's what kind of started me on this feeling of betrayal, right? Because I was like, it's right here in the diary, right? It's like it wasn't like it was like somewhere hidden, right? It was like very explicit and very plain. Um, and so I started going into the West Bank with Rabbis for Human Rights, which I felt like was, a kind of good mix for me of like still in a Jewish framework, right? And what we were doing was actually teaching English as a second language to Bedouin children in the West Bank. So it wasn't, necessarily just in understanding Palestinian civil society or anything like that, but it was like seeing how these Bedouin lived in these like corrugated cardboard boxes, and the just how stark the differences are between within the green line and outside the green line, right? So that started, um, and then just kind of starting to be exposed through Rabbis for Human Rights and through these Palestinian students that I befriended eventually, just kind of reading and relearning and unlearning everything that I had been taught. One of the other formative things that year was I had a scholarship through the Jewish Federation, um, that took me that year during Passover to the Ukraine, where we were put in a van with Ukrainian college students and a couple of us American college students, and we traveled around the Ukraine leading Passover seders in kind of these shtetls, like small villages. And I ended up being assigned to southern Ukraine, which is actually where my mother's side of the family is from, and was in like ended up going to where she was from, like the actual shtetl. And that was actually that was like another layer for me, right? I've been starting to understand Palestinians, right, as the primary victims of Zionism. But then here I was in this land that my ancestors came from. And what I was being encouraged to do was to encourage the people that we met and any young people that we met to immigrate to Israel, right? Like, and I started to, and something just didn't work for me of like, why are we not trying to still remain tethered to these ancestral places where we were? Like, why are we abandoning them for Israel? And it wasn't like I had like a sophisticated understanding of like settler colonialism or anything at that point. Like I just was like, it felt off to me, And I remember a conversation with one of the young people we met, a Ukrainian Jewish person in southern Ukraine, who we were like, why don't you move to Israel? Like there's so many more young Jews there. And And he said, well, who will take care of the Jewish cemeteries if I leave? And I think that was very formative for me. And I remember that really clearly. It's like one of the main things I remember from that trip. And it's kind of in the decades since then, it's reverberated at different moments, right? I remember in the Trump years when Jewish cemeteries were being desecrated here in the US, like I thought about that a lot. Like, and it kind of fed into my own sense of responsibility to ancestral places. And it became started to understand that there's a loss of Jewish communal life and spiritual life through focusing all of our communal energy on this hyper militarized ethno state. And the Ukrainian college students that I was traveling around with, a lot of them had just learned they were Jewish when they started college because the Soviet era fear around Jewish identity was so ingrained in their families that they kind of kept it a secret, right? And so part of the time that we were traveling around, we were like explaining Judaism to them and Jewishness. It was a really deep experience. And I think to me that I like think about that a lot as like in parallel that year of what I was doing was kind of like understanding Palestinian dispossession as the core violence of Zionism, and then understanding that there's like understanding the need to tend to diasporic Jewishness, and that there's a loss for Judaism and Jewishness when we homogenize ourselves right into Zionism.
Yeah, that story is just wow. If anything teaches the notion of doikite, of making
Yes, yeah,
coherence,
exactly.
that is, you may not have had the vocabulary for it yet, but that is just kind of stopping me in my tracks, thinking about it as somebody who wants to kind of further and practice, particularly on a podcast about education, the idea of like learning and teaching, embodying doikite. That's wow. So I'm imagining then maybe you, after this year, you go back and you're like, hey, did you all know we should be fighting for Palestinian liberation? Actually,
Yeah.
And I think that might even tie into how this continues to be a relationship to family and friends and folks who, amidst this current genocide, what happened when you came back and brought this new knowledge and this unlearning to your communities? You were still in college at the time?
Yeah, I
Maybe?
had
Yeah.
one. So I didn't stay, obviously. I was like, okay, I got to go back. I ended up being there for 13 months, so like a pretty long junior year. And when I came back, the second intifada was breaking out. And the fellowship that I had actually required me to do some things that year back on campus. I was at Indiana University in Bloomington, and I thought to organize a peace vigil, which also was like now I'm like there's all these cringy parts of my political beginnings. But I was like, oh, it was like really like right because it's the second intifada broke out like literally when I got back right in that early 2000, and I was like, let's have a rabbi and a priest and the imam and my scholarship was threatened that I had because I was like supporting the enemy. It's like that was then the next layer on top of my learning was like, because this wasn't a time when the kind of repression that we now know as so commonplace in the Jewish community was really like I had no idea, right? Like I was like feeling this out kind of for myself. Like I didn't go back to the same friend group that I had when I left because I had gone through such a transformation and was part of like the Hillel before I left. But when I came back my senior year, that wasn't a home for me anymore. Um, and kind of and it was so confusing to me because these are the people that raised me. Like I was active in the Jewish Federation as a child, and as a young person, like I learned organizing right through that. Like I learned like the brass tacks of how to organize teenager through being a Zionist educator. And like it didn't make sense. Like I feel like I was like applying the values that I thought I was being taught and applying them to what I was seeing. And then I was being faced with such resistance, right? That also was radicalizing for me. Um, so I ended up like basically my next move was to go somewhere where there was going to be other Jews like me because it was a very isolating experience. I spent that year in Jerusalem. A cousin of mine had graduated high school and she decided to come and we went through this transformation together and she did a gap year before going to college and she and I went through this transformation together. Which was actually really important. Like I like it was like me and her against the world, you know? And so we kind of like but it doesn't quite work to do it just you and a friend, right? Like that's not like how you really can like steel yourself for this. So I decided to move to New York City where I knew there would be all kinds of crazy Jews, including Jews who thought like me. And I was right. And I found a group called Jews Against the Occupation, and I joined them. But right when I moved to New York City, of course, 2 weeks after was September 11th. And so,
Wow.
you know, I had the next layer, right, for me was before like basically the story goes that then I was like on a fast track to becoming a leftist, right, when I moved to New York City.
I do want to talk about where this led you, and maybe I'm jumping over a bunch, but for me, um, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, the RRC, has this kind of mythical and unknown factor. But I believe you went there. So what led you there? And maybe we could get into a little bit like what is this place? My partner, yeah, please.
It's an interesting, yeah. So I had no idea about Reconstructionism until that year that I was in Avodah, the Jewish Service Corps program, where part of the program is that there's like uh, some programming that happens on the weekends or in the evenings. And one of the programs that year was a talk about revelation, right? So like the receiving of Torah at Sinai. And they had rabbis, an Orthodox rabbi, a conservative rabbi, a Reform rabbi, and a Reconstructionist rabbi come and talk about their perspectives of revelation. And I was so drawn to how the Reconstructionist rabbi understood Jewish history and Jewish time, and relationship to contemporary considerations, right? Like I had never quite like it just like worked for me, right? And I was really seeking at that point, like what, I was in such a like an internal crisis of like who am I and what am I, right? Like I was having this huge break from my family of origin. And also at the same time, still very deeply rooted and associated with like Jewish life. And then Reconstructionism was presented to me as this way of understanding that Judaism is a religious civilization that over time is has evolved consistently, right? So there's it's not a dynamic, it's not like a static tradition where it stopped evolving. Like it's always been evolving, right? And so that was very empowering to me. So that because I think I kind of understood was that like Judaism was something that happened in the past and then it stopped and now you just enact it and receive it. And you're not part of shaping it. But the way that Reconstructionists understand Jewish time, which I think is true, is that it's always been in process of evolution, that in every generation, Jews engage with the tradition, but then also are part of the world. And so bring their contemporary influences to understand how to have Jewish life continue to move, right? And evolve, right? So you have, for example, like ultra-Orthodox Jews who froze Jewish time at a certain point in like the 17th century Europe, right? And that's, the clothes that they wear were from weren't Jewish necessarily. They were like what was worn at that time in Poland when they kind of froze Jewish time. But everybody else in Jewish time continued to evolve. Um, and so that really drew me to Reconstructionism, that understanding that we all are responsible for making sure Judaism endures as a tradition through which people can make meaning, find connection, find solace, right? And be tethered to history while at the same time not having to abandon contemporary values. And I was also really struck by how Reconstructionists, did that evolving like in really practical terms, right? So they were the first to take the chosen people language out of Jewish liturgy, understanding that there actually is an impact, right? Where if you repeat a certain idea over and over again, it kind of can confuse, right? Yourself about like who we are, and that we need to be really diligent, that our words match our values, and that, Reconstructionism has been at the forefront of challenging American Jewish orthodoxies and integrating feminism and queerness into study and practice. And that, so it felt really ripe for me that that would be the place where, of any place to become a rabbi, that I could bring, like when I started rabbinical school, I was already an anti-Zionist. And I was actually urged to become a rabbi by my Jews Against the Occupation comrades, who were like, you're an organizer, you have all this Jewish knowledge, there's no rabbis that represent us, like go be that rabbi for us. And that's kind of how I got nudged along. And I mean, I think I also had a self-interest in going to rabbinical school, of like owning Judaism for myself and relearning it without Zionism. Like it was a chance for me to kind of redo the Jewish education I had as a child, like, and to get a liberal arts education, honestly, which I didn't get quite at IU where I went to college, because it was at the Reconstructionist school that like there was like feminist and queer theory that was integrated into the education, right? Like that I didn't get exactly where at IU for whatever set of reasons. And the way that the curriculum has changed since I was there, but I really loved the curriculum when I was there. I'm sad that they changed it because I thought it was really brilliant. And the way that it worked was it was a 5-year program. And over the 5 years, each year went through Jewish time. So the first year was biblical, the second year was rabbinic, the third year was medieval, the fourth year was modern, and the fifth year was contemporary. And so in each of those years, you studied the traditional texts of that time, but also the social history of that time, right? So you kind of they understood that like you can't just read a text without understanding what people were, what the like the life experience was, right? Like of the people writing these texts, right? And because you don't think it was like divinely written, right? You understand that there were, and so you had to understand like what was the life of the rabbis when they started writing the Talmud. And actually, the first reading from my rabbinic thought class that I had was actually a work by Edward Said from this collection of essays on exile. And because exile is such a central experience for Judaism, right? Like what I got out of my education at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College was this understanding that before the destruction of the Second Temple, you could talk about Israelite religion. And it's after that you could talk about Judaism. Judaism is a tradition that was born in diaspora and for the spiritual experience of exile. And so the teacher wanted us to ground us in this experience of exile and like, what does that feel like to understand as we go into study Talmud, like this is the spiritual and psychological experience that the rabbis are in. And that was really powerful for me. So it like helped me, like I feel like the education I got there was really a stellar educational environment where I was like able to like reassemble my own sense of Jewish history and Jewish time and 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 have all this Jewish knowledge that I had like put into context where it felt like it was a little bit floating before.
Yeah. And that, I mean, unlike your, I think you said it was summer camp or
Yeah.
um, uh, that is explicitly Farrian to me. The idea of
Yeah.
that's truly reading the word by reading the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it sounds like at this time you're outside of the RRC reading, engaging with Palestine, Palestinians, Palestinian literature. Was that written into the curriculum? Were there other anti-Zionist organizers at the RRC?
No, when I was there, I mean, now there are so many, but when I was there, this is kind of like a theme from my early life is that I was kind of like a little bit of a little solo, like on my own, kind of like forging these like in different spaces. I was the only one with my politics at the time,
Mm.
but which was significant. It was really challenging, even though I had a really great educational experience. There were also these really challenging elements, which is one of them is that there's a requirement that you spend a year studying in Israel in rabbinical school. And every rabbinical school has that requirement. And I negotiated with them that instead of spending a year in Israel, which means like living in occupied West Jerusalem studying, like I just like wasn't going to go study in a yeshiva in West Jerusalem. Like that wasn't going to be what I like, didn't feel up for that. I negotiated with them that instead I would spend every summer there. And I spent the summers living in the West Bank with this group called the International Women's Peace Service, where Palestinian Nonviolent Coordinating Committee kind of set up this house for women from all over the world to come and do human rights monitoring. And so I did that every summer of rabbinical school. And that was, I mean, this was through the years 2004 to 2009. And those were the years when the apartheid wall was being built and snaking through. And so every summer I would consecutively see the way that it was cutting off Palestinians from each other, stealing land, had really intense experiences where we lived in the West Bank was proximate to a lot of these were like really outpost ideological Jewish settlements where I had a lot of intense encounters with Jewish settlers and army. And at a certain point, the school got wind people outside the school got wind of me and put pressure on the school to kick me out, not ordain me. And I was able to prevent that from happening, obviously, but it was, without getting into all the gory details of it, was a really unsettling experience, and challenging experience. And at the same time, like when I went into rabbinical school, I knew it was going to be challenging. And one of the things that I think I felt at the time was, which we haven't discussed yet, is that, before I went between the years 2000 and 2004, when I started rabbinical school, when I was in this like fast track, like relearning, unlearning, kind of re-understanding myself and my place in the world, I had like a really big break with my family. And so by the time I got to rabbinical school, I felt like even though I knew it was going to be challenging, I was like, I already did the most challenging thing, right? Of having to break with my family. So it was like nothing was going to be as painful as that was going to have been, right? So when I started to build what has ended up being what I needed to do this work for so many decades now is, a very thick skin of being able to not let stuff get at me, and that's a really hard way of being in the world. But it ended up being a self-protective mechanism, that I needed to protect myself with in order to live my life in accordance with my own values.
And it's in addition to that, you're also building family, building community, building home, which I think is maybe a great entry point to. I love these moments when you and your co-author have kind of been with me all weekend as I pour through. This is a podcast. People can't see. I'm holding up your book. Yeah. Which part of this is about building
political home.
Yeah. And I have many questions about this and many comments. And I know you're one author and one prominent part of this larger movement. But since this is an educational podcast, I thought we could start with the educational aspect. And normally when I speak to somebody, I have to kind of read education into it and think about where that intersects. But lessons is literally written into the subtitle. And I'm wondering where that came in, because this is the story of JVP. And this is the story of how Jews can study and struggle in solidarity for a free Palestine. But this isn't your or Rebecca's story. It isn't an oral history. Like I heard about this when it was coming out and thought like, oh, cool. Like that organization I'm in, I can hear like the history of it, and that's in there. But it's not like a collected oral history of JVP 2000 to present. So why is it? I could talk about. I highlighted some of the questions for reflection at the end of chapters. Like, why is it constructed in this kind of pedagogical way?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think, when we decided to write the book, we decided to write it for a few reasons. One is that, and in that way, is because we have each really benefited from organizers who have written, reflected on their years of organizing and what worked and what didn't work. And so we felt we had learned the hard way a lot of really important organizing lessons. And so we kind of felt a responsibility, right, to contribute to organizing craft through sharing those lessons, right? And that part of it is that the JVP story isn't over. JVP is continuing, is like an ongoing organization. So it wasn't time to write a definitive history, right? What it was time for was understanding that she and I were leaders of this organization at a critical 10-year period where JVP really evolved to being a political force to reckon with in the US. And it's important to note that we finished the manuscript in September 2023, which is wild to think about. We had no idea the world that the book was going to come into. And it's actually like so much more relevant now, right? Honestly, about what the lessons were because of, the moment that this political moment we're in of organizing against genocide, right? Like the worst case scenario of what the next phase of this horror was going to be. So we wanted it to be focused on lessons that other movements can use as well as our movement. And we wanted it to be contributing to organizing as craft. We really feel like organizing is a really important tool, and it's actually really different than mobilization, and different than activism, right? That organizing is a really essential tool to world building, making the new world. And I am an educator. I identify in part as an educator. Like that's how I got my start, right? And then throughout my years at JVP, I helped put together two curriculums, first called Facing the Nakba and the second around Islamophobia. And so we did feel like we wanted it to have really be like a workbook that organizers from any movement could pick up and learn something about the Palestine Solidarity Movement and learn something about the Jewish wing of the Palestine Solidarity Movement, but more importantly, have concrete lessons that they could use to like not make the same mistakes that we did, or make them in a different way, or learn from the things that really worked for us. And I think like the final piece is that we actually were trying to like embody what we taught. Like when we would do leadership development institutes and do these like weekend-long trainings for JVP organizers, I would always emphasize that a campaign or a project isn't complete until you've done debrief and evaluation, right? That's actually an essential part of a life cycle of any campaign or project. And so even with something as massive as running an organization for a decade, like we also needed to do that debrief and evaluation so that we could like that actually is an essential part. And so this book was that evaluation process for us.
And I'm going to try to not just delve into all my questions about this book, and also I apologize that I do have a couple of questions that I hope that these are connecting to fighting and ending the genocide and the broader lessons. But as I wrote them out, I thought, oh my God, I'm being like Rabbi Wise as a police teacher. So I don't want to make this my therapy session, but I think there's
but we could do that a little bit.
I want to have nothing to do with this, but I just have this. I think there's one story in here. For me, anti-Zionism meant untethering from Judaism for a long time. And I really, really struggled with, what that meant. But I'm not doing it justice, but there's this beautiful story that I had my own version of recently. And I think many other Jews as well have, talking about protesting TIAA Kref.
Oh, yeah.
And this person named Jethro who had resisted and then was emotional. And I had, there was a JVP action that I participated in at the beginning of the high holidays. And I'm still kind of in this process of like my partner and I have been talking about going to Colsetic since we moved back to Philly during the pandemic. And I'm always resistant. But so beyond my process, it's just in that moment that I had struggled and thought more of JVP as a mechanism to help organize and fight in solidarity for Free Palestine. I heard the shofar and I looked over at these people huddled behind banners and just kind of, I was overcome with emotion. And I think there's something that no matter how far I get from my Jewish upbringing and no matter how much I want to break from it, the second I hear L'chad Odi, there's something in my DNA that just is activated. So I'm wondering, maybe just thinking out loud about the kind of relationship, any ideas of why for you this feeling of I need to fight the apartheid state, I need to fight this ethno state, was that a recommitment to Judaism, and why fight as Jews perhaps?
Yeah, it's a really powerful and important question. And I think, I want to say a thing just for listeners who this might benefit them, their own understanding it, just to say it very explicitly, which is that Judaism is a religious civilization that's thousands of years old. Zionism is a political movement that it's only over 120 years old. It started in the late 19th century. And Judaism has been kind of hijacked by Zionism. And Judaism, as I understand it, is fundamentally anti-Zionist, meaning Judaism, as I was saying before, is a tradition that was built for the experience of exile and the experience of diaspora, right? It's baked into the religious kind of tools of Judaism is being away from center, right? There's this longing, right, for a reunification in a messianic time, but Judaism really isn't messianic in the way that Christianity is, right? Like it's like a perpetual longing and a really articulation of like the human experience of being separated. So I think that for me, I say all that because I think it's really important to me. Like I feel very Mother Berry about Judaism. Like I want to protect it, right? And I feel really um angry at the ways that Zionism, which by the way is a political ideology that was fomented first by Christians and then kind of given to Jews as a way out, as a really flawed and horrific mistake of a way out of Christian anti-Semitism, that the ways in which it has kind of like taken, and so many Jews have allowed our traditions to be used to justify violence, right? And so for me, I feel like I feel like it's a little bit delicate, right? At the like how to talk about this, because at the one hand, I don't want to reify the idea that Judaism and Zionism are synonymous, right? And so I want to be able to hold Judaism is separate from Zionism, and I need to be able to hold at the same time, right, that the way that Judaism has evolved in this moment is that most Jewish communities still, though this is changing, are allegiant to Zionism, right? So it's like holding these contradictions at the same time, which I think is really hard, right? And I think we need to rebuild our skills of that on the left. And I think this political moment is teaching us that. So I think that for me, here's a story that I think encapsulates it for me. There was this moment when I was doing that work I mentioned when I was in rabbinical school of protective presence work in the West Bank. And I was assigned, basically the logic is that if people who are not Palestinian are around Palestinians, people will be less violent to Palestinians. So I was assigned one day to accompany a Palestinian to graze his sheep on his land, where recently Israel had made a road cut through his land where Palestinians aren't allowed to be on. So anytime he would step across the road to his own land, he would be shot at by settlers or military. So I was assigned to kind of spend the day with him so he could graze his flock. And we didn't have much language in common to speak. So it was a kind of a quiet, solitary day with him. And at a certain point, I was kind of just thinking about how unpredictable it is that I was going to be there. This like middle-class white girl from Cincinnati, like raised in a Zionist family, is spending her like putting my life on the line. Like, I don't think I really thought of it that way, but I understood there was some risk there to protect this Palestinian shepherd. And the golden rule came into my mind. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And in Hebrew, it's v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. And the reacha is like what is translated as your neighbor, but it actually also means, that word also means shepherd. So it's like, you shall love your shepherd as yourself, right? And I was like, that's literally what I was doing in that moment, right? And it like was this like, I was like, that was my like, I think that was the moment where like I really settled in deeper into myself of understanding how intertwined the fight for Palestinian liberation is for ensuring that there is a Judaism that's worthy to be passed down to future generations, right? Like I feel and understand that many generations of my family continue to be Jewish when it really would have been easier to not be, right? There were many moments throughout my family's history where converting to Christianity and leaving Judaism would have meant a much safer and happier and healthier, comfortable life. And they didn't do that. And I feel like it's not, in my time, it's not, I am responsible for making similar choices, and so I feel that when we as Jews oppose Zionism, enacting this kind of violence in the name of Judaism, we are doing healing, right? Healing work. And I also feel like you don't need to be Jewish to do it, right? Like I think most of those things are at the same time. Like there's nothing. Like I think that part of this work of separating Judaism from Zionism, which I feel like is like a dogged commitment. Like you have to be doing it at every moment because they're so intertwined that's like you have to literally be like sifting through, right? All of that at every moment. And I think that, it makes sense to me that when you hear the shofar, right? Like this ancient sound that I feel like is like one of the oldest practices, right? In Jewish tradition, right? That it would stir something in you, right? And that it would remind you of your responsibilities and your sense of accountability in the world. And I think that's what my hope is, to inspire a broader and successive generations of Jews, that when they hear the shofar, they hear the ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You should love your shepherd as yourself.
I have a few quotes from your book, but I'm going to just read this one. So we hope that these reflections, this is for anybody who buys the book, which everybody should. It's on page 29. You say, we hope that these reflections on JVP's organizing successes and failures can offer to every social justice movement opportunities to draw crucial lessons and strategies for the ongoing collective work of building hope, justice, and power, always rooted in love. And for me, these entwined notions of love and rage are so important. And since I've been an anti-Zionist, I would say at least since October 7th, the rage part has come so easily and so fully. And I have had a very difficult time when I see so much of the genocide unfolding every day, tapping into any form of love. And I wonder if you have any rabbinical guidance, any personal guidance, any organizing guidance for those who are only doing the rage part, if the love can still come into that resistance and struggle.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And I assume that what you're saying, though, is that it's hard for you to feel love for Jewish people broadly, right? Is that what you're saying? Like, what is like, because I feel like maybe say another sentence about that, because I wonder about.
I think what is, sometimes in the, like, I'm in a couple of committees in JVP that are, get into I think a great pairing to your book is, I'm sure folks have said this to you, let this radicalize you. And so much of that helps you get into the mundane, everyday aspects of organizing work.
Yeah.
And for me, sometimes what keeps me going, I need to be fueled by something, right? And a commitment to liberation should be driven by love and care and connection. But when I think about like, why do I show up when I'm exhausted? Why do I, do anything? Why do I enjoy doing this podcast because I connect to people and get to do interviews. But like, if it does anything, I'm driven by a deep sense of rage at the Israeli state and a deep sense of wanting to fight that through my rage, which maybe is very, podcast rage is me doing an Ira Glass impression and rambling, but the rage is down here somewhere, and the love, I don't know where that is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that, we chose the title Solidarity as the Political Version of Love, which is actually a quote from Melanie K. Kantrowitz, of blessed memory, who is a Jewish feminist writer and activist. And we chose that because it really feels like, and I could just speak for myself, that my dedicating my life to Palestine solidarity work is an expression of love, not just for Palestinians, but also for Jews and for all people, right? That there is a sense that even when I'm at my most rageful, I'm rageful because I love the world and don't want to watch it burn, right? I'm rageful because I love this tradition and I hate the way that it's been used to justify violence, right? And like I'm rageful, but it's like I love my children and I want them to have a future that's like livable, right? And meaningful. And so I think that for me, they are two sides of the same coin, the love and the rage, right? And I that if I didn't love the world, if I didn't love this tradition, if I didn't love people, like I wouldn't feel rage, right? I wouldn't be as angry as I am, right? And so for me, that's how I think about it, and I think one of the core lessons of the book and just of my organizing life, as you spoke to before, is that no one can survive doing this kind of work without having people around them who love them and who you love and who remind you why you go about doing this work. Like it would just be impossible, right? And I think in particular in Jewish anti-Zionist organizing, where for most of us, we have had to give up some amount of communal comfort in order to do this work, right? And surrounding yourself with people who remind you, what is the world that you're working for, right? And I think, it's really hard right now. It's, and I don't want to sugarcoat it. Like, it's like, I resonate with what you're saying and that it's true. Like, am I fueled by rage or love? But I know when I'm like, and am able to connect to love, it's like, I get better results, right? I get smarter strategies. I get more impactful conversations. I get more meaningful ways to communicate what I want to say, right? And so I do think it's two sides of the same coin. And I think that there is a responsibility to, in whatever ways, right? Even if it's not going to services and praying, but what are the other ways that you could take time in your life to cultivate love, and to notice what you love, right? And I think that's one of the things that spiritual life, religious life can offer you, is just moments to pause, to reflect on your life. And I hope that all people, regardless of their religious inclinations or spiritual inclinations, still do that work, because I think it's a very grounding practice to be able to like be in gratitude, and notice what it is you love and what it is that you're fighting for.
Today's episode was produced by Yardain Imran and Samantha Haley. If you like our podcast, please give us a rating on whatever you use to listen to podcasts. Also, please follow us on Another Ed is Possible. We're on Instagram. We're also going to continue to share lots of mutual aid campaigns there, highlight those, and we encourage listeners to donate and support in many different ways. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Another Education is Possible.